Welcome, welcome everybody. I am Kelly Ross, work group facilitator, excited to be with you today. I want to put up this slide you have seen before if you have been here with our etiquette, the way that we would love to engage with one another. Today we have 2 hours. We're talking all about data sharing with state agencies and wildfire risk assessment. 5 speakers that are going to share with us. I'll introduce you to those as we get into the conversation. Because we have so many folks, if we don't have time for every question, as always, I will send you a survey link after this call, and Deanne is also going to put the link. It's open already, so if you prefer to make your comments and questions as we go through, you can certainly do that. Thanks, Deanne. And if you're a working group member, you are considered a panelist in the Zoom vernacular, and so you can also use the chat function during the meeting. If you're an attendee, that survey link is available for you to make any comments. We are live on TVW, and we are also being recorded, both of which you'll be able to access after the meeting from the working group website. Deanne's also put the working group webpage in the chat there, where you can find lots more information, including, we thank you for the input on the survey from last week, survey number 4. That summary is up on the website already. And with that, I think I'm going to take this slide down and let's get into our first presentation. So first up, I want to introduce you to Steve Brooks, Executive Director, Washington Association of Fire Chiefs. Steve, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Kelly. And good morning, everyone. Bear with me as I make sure technology is working here, and hopefully you are now seeing my slides. I want to first say thank you for the accommodation of the group. I was actually scheduled to present this last week at the beginning and had some limitations in my schedule due to a board meeting of our association leadership. And candidly, I'm thankful that happened, because it actually, while I wasn't able to attend the meeting in person, I was able to go back and review all of the information shared last week. And I think it really helped to inform some of the things that I want to highlight today. It both, I think, validated some of my personal experience as a recently retired local fire chief, along with all of the work that I've now done in the 20 years of membership with the Washington Fire Chiefs, who I get to represent as their executive director now. So really my goal today is just to highlight for those especially who I know may represent or work more actively in other states, maybe some of the nuances or unique elements of the Washington Fire Service, and candidly try to help share what we believe, some of our leadership believes, is some gaps and potential opportunities that I think this foundation and this group can be a great catalyst for bridging in the future. Hopefully it's opening up some great conversations. And so with that, I will just begin before I start through my slides with saying some of the themes that I noticed last week that, again, I think validate some of my personal experience and that of some of our leadership is a gap, if you will, that exists between the evaluation strategies used for things like risk scoring in the wildfire arena at the property level, and things like community level assessments based on and mitigation strategies like Firewise and other great programs that are out there that allow communities to rally together to do things like fuel management, proactive other elements that they can do as a community. But the one place that we feel really strongly about that, and I think it was highlighted through some of the questions that I appreciated from both Commissioner Cooter and Senator Short and others last week, is kind of that specific role of the local fire suppression jurisdictions in each community, and how those may play a role in these efforts to mitigate and suppress wildfire when they do happen. So with that, what I thought I would do, and hopefully at the risk, I never want to insult anyone's intelligence, but knowing that every state is different, I do want to quickly run through just a highlight, if my slides will start to advance for me, a highlight of some nuances of the Washington Fire Service, just for those who may not be aware. So there are approximately, and again, this can vary day to day just with mergers, consolidations, but just short of 400 separate agencies or entities that actually provide local and regional fire protection across Washington state. Those are broken out into the 3 broad categories. Probably the most familiar to a lot is municipal fire departments. Many times when you hear fire departments and fire are considered a city functionality. And this is certainly true in certain areas of Washington, but mainly in our larger municipal and urban centers. Municipal fire departments, as everyone is aware, are run by elements of city government. And that certainly does, again, exist in areas of the higher density and urban populations, but is honestly not the primary role or mechanism through which fire suppression is provided in the vast majority of the communities that we're highlighting through these discussions. Those are largely and almost exclusively protected by one of two other entities, either fire districts, which again, without too much history lesson, all the way back to the 1940s when there was empowering statutes here in the state of Washington to form local fire districts. For those who may work primarily in other states, this is not so uncommon in the West Coast, I think, but I came actually from the East Coast, as you might pick up from the accent as I talk faster through the presentation. But these special purpose districts were actually formed, and we have lots of special purpose districts here in Washington for other purposes as well. But fire districts are by far the most common, and they are generally held at a county level geography. And so they were formed by those local communities by votes of the local populace, like I said, back in the 1940s and 50s primarily. And they are able then to organize, and they serve as junior taxing districts within county government and are able to directly levy property tax to fund their activities. The newest mechanism that was actually first empowered in 2004, and then the first one was actually formed in 2007, are regional fire authorities. These are a mechanism that were really designed to allow merger, consolidation, efficiencies, or economies of scale by other entities. Sometimes it's municipal departments, sometimes it's two or more fire districts or other entities coming together, again, through a vote of the people to form a generally larger and hopefully more efficient and effective fire suppression and emergency medical and rescue and other forces. So that really was the focus of the legislation, was to allow a great mechanism. And this is not totally uncommon, but I believe there are some unique elements of what we have here in Washington that make it a very effective model that we've seen a lot of. At last count, we believe we have about 16, somewhere between 16 and 20 of those regional fire authorities, either in existence or close to formation. From all of those agencies that provide fire service, just a quick overview of how they're staffed and what they do. Again, most of those municipal departments, those larger entities, are exclusively career. So they have all career employed fire service or fire suppression professionals that do that. Others in much of our rural parts of the state may have exclusively volunteer providers who come in and do this just as a part of their community service. Much of the training, certification, and the like is consistent across those, and so you can understand why that's a huge undertaking and commitment for those volunteers. And then by far the most common that we have across the state is a combination workforce, where a group of volunteers support an existing career workforce in a given community. Again, not the topics of today, but I think it's important to highlight that we don't just do fire service. Medical and rescue services are actually the lion's share of the daily responses. And so those are governed by Department of Health, who offers licensure in that arena, just for familiarity. And those can be all the way from the basic to the advanced levels, and also offer other technical specialties, which sometimes can cross over into the wildfire arena and things related to rescue, especially in the midst of conflagration and other large-scale community disasters. But then the big thing that we're obviously focused on, that I want to spend the majority of my time on today, is talking about fire suppression, and particularly wildfire suppression. But I think it's important to do a quick comparison of how it both is similar and, more importantly, different than the structural fire protection. And I appreciated the comments by some of those last week. I think Verisk and others referenced the current mechanisms that we have in place for evaluating the capability of local fire service really were built primarily around structural, single structure, single residential in almost every case, fire suppression. So what is the likelihood of being able to put out in an effective time frame with limited damage or risk to life and property in a single family dwelling? And then those are extrapolated out to larger commercial structures. But there really is not a good crossover, I don't believe, to the wildfire arena. And I want to give a shout out again to the Office of the Insurance Commissioner and Commissioner Cooter and her staff that this is a separate area that we're focusing on right now, is to find out ways that we can look at even those processes that I will come back to a little later in my presentation, to where those can be more effective as well. But I think this really identifies a significant gap that we have in how those local capabilities are evaluated in the wildfire arena. They do require very differing equipment, vehicles or apparatus to respond, and the supplies that are associated, along with those separate and special training and certification requirements. Again, my slides are fairly simplistic, but I love telling stories through pictures. So I'm just going to throw up a few pictures to just maybe highlight some similarities and difference. So most of the time when people think of the fire department and fire trucks, you think of something like this. This is a typical fire engine. Again, without attempting not to get too technical, there are actually 7 different specific types of fire engines that are recognized in the United States. This is what we call a type 1. This is basically the one that in order to be recognized as a fire department, everybody has to have at least one of these. This is what's designed for structural fire protection. Generally, there are standards by the National Fire Protection Association and others that kind of dictate or at least recommend the staffing levels of these. And you, I'm sure, are all very familiar with seeing these running up and down the roads of your local community. You probably also recognize the limitations of these types of apparatus and vehicles in the wildfire arena. I know what was talked about last week is one of the big considerations that is given is road access when you're providing wildfire risk scores and assessments. And that certainly is understandable, but I think it's also important to highlight some of the mitigation strategies and kind of creative approaches that the fire service has taken to try to overcome some of those. And so I want to quickly highlight some variations of those 7 types of fire engines that exist. Again, I'm not going to give you all 7, but this is one that is kind of the middle grade. So I believe this would be a type 3 engine. So the one that you just saw is a type 1. And as they move from type 1 to type 7, it's not exclusively that they go down in size, but that is one component. But their maneuverability, their capability to gain access or provide fire suppression on undeveloped or more primitive roadways is an important factor. If you've watched, particularly in the California arena, this is a very common type of platform that's used there. One that's even more common here in the state of Washington is the smaller apparatuses, I believe is what we call a type 6. The nice thing about these, any of these in the wildfire arena, anything basically below that type 1 and 2 apparatus, is that the cost of these is significantly less than the type 1 apparatus, and in some cases can actually be built or developed by the local fire service communities or in partnership with some of the other existing resources. And there are programs that make these available to small and rural fire districts after they've been used by some of the public entities. And you can see just by the basic design of these that these allow access into fairly austere environments where road infrastructure may not be good. This is a water tender, and so this is really where we bridge that capability because we can't do effective fire suppression in most cases without an adequate water supply. And again, in the structural arena, a lot of times that's measured by your proximity to a fire hydrant or your ability to bring water through something like this, a water tender. These usually vary anywhere from about 1,500 gallons up to 3,000 or more gallons of water. So basically considered a rolling bathtub, if you will. It's able to come into a community and not really provide the direct fire suppression, but to refill those other vehicles that you just saw as they go out and do their deployment. These are generally staged in a regional area where those other vehicles can come back to them as a static water supply or source, or they can be mobile and move around and resupply those in the wildfire arena when the road infrastructure allows. And I quickly want to highlight before I move on to the closing part of my comments, just some of the other capabilities that I'm proud to say that many agencies here in Washington have kind of taken on at the fire service level. Often these have historically and in many other states really have relied on either state level resources or private contractors or some combination, but we actually have fire jurisdictions here in the state of Washington who have active bulldozer programs, fallers in the arena of actually being able to manage trees. And we even have some fire agencies who have made the significant investment of air assets at the agency level and have helicopters that they're able to deploy both within their jurisdictions and regionally as assets. So just again, a shout out to those agencies who take that as a proactive step. Really where I want to focus my time, and I feel like that gap that I alluded to at the beginning is this critical role of the initial attack. When a fire is in its infancy, I know it was talked about a lot last week that I think it was 86% of our properties in the state of Washington are low risk, and so it's really that other 14% that I know we're all focused on. And the discussion about that the vast majority of the loss exists in those major conflagratory environments, those conflagrations that take over large either communities or and sometimes you can wipe out entire towns. We certainly respect and understand that. And in the fire service, we understand the essential nature of solvency for the insurance industry and managing those risks. But what we really do want to highlight is to make sure that everyone remembers that 95+% of the average wildfires that break out in our state and really, in our region, are held to 10 acres or less. And I was excited to see when some of the statistics were put up last week, thankfully, from a Washington perspective, while I don't wish any ill will on any of our neighboring agencies, I noticed in the top 20 list, there were none of the highest loss wildfires over that past period of time that originated in Washington, obviously largely California, which many of the risk factors there, they have no control over, I understand. But I know Oregon was on the list. But thankfully, in the last decade, really since we had some of our largest and most impactful events, I believe that this is evidence of some of the great preventative and proactive work that has been done both by the legislature, by the Department of Natural Resources, and the fire service at large. And again, thanks to our elected officials for seeing that need and being proactive in both the funding and the resource strategies of that. And so I really believe that these strong local and regional partnerships are what aid in this early approach to initial attack. And so for those who may not be familiar, nearly every, if not every community in our state has some level of mutual aid, automatic responses that when a fire breaks out, if the local primary jurisdiction is unable to provide all of the resources necessary for that initial attack, they are automatically able to reach across borders to where it becomes a seamless and borderless response by all of the surrounding entities to come in. And I think that is a true kind of cornerstone, if you will, of our effective fire suppression forces. Once those have reached their capacity or have exceeded their capabilities, then we do also have what I believe is a very strong and scalable allocation process through a statewide mobilization plan. Again, our Office of the State Fire Marshal reviews and monitors this plan annually and makes updates as necessary, highlighting again some things that have happened even in the most recent legislative sessions that we were able to codify what had been a previous test period of doing pre-mobilization or pre-positioning of resources when weather conditions or other risk factors show a high likelihood of outbreak. And so I believe these are all proactive strategies that we've been able to deploy here in the state that really have allowed us to be on the forefront of risk mitigation and making our communities more resilient. And so I hope that those, as we move forward, can also be considered in this risk modeling process. Also, I need to shout out to Commissioner Upthegrove's agency and the strategic crew placement that the Department of Natural Resources does with both ground and air assets around the state based on that risk profiling and things. And while they can't be there for the initial attack in many cases, they are a strong support that comes in to support those local assets as fires do grow. Quickly in closing, just to talk about what was mentioned, the current evaluation and rating systems. So the Washington Survey and Rating Bureau, I know there was quite a bit of discussion about ISO, I think from the Veris presenter last week. If you're not familiar, Washington is one, I believe now, of only 5 states that has an independent rating bureau. But again, its primary focus, very similar to ISO, is on structural firefighting capabilities, and it's on a 5-year for the average agency update cycle. I was encouraged to hear that there are mechanisms in place and being developed more fully that will allow for kind of real-time updates and reevaluation of mitigation strategies, because obviously a lot changes in a 5-year time plan. And so we want to see mechanisms in our local communities where we as the fire service can partner with property owners and others to see more regular and frequent improvements in those risk modeling and more accurate reflection of what actually exists in a given community. The other mechanisms that we have that are really more at the agency level, as far as their own ability to kind of steer that, is just an accreditation board. So there is the Centers for Public Safety Excellence, which has a process for developing a standard of cover along with model policies and practices. And when developing that standard of cover, what you're doing is essentially identifying the primary risks in a given community. And so for many, that could be wildfire being a primary or even the primary risk, versus in others, it could be falls, because they're much more high density. And so their medical and health evaluation is important. And so this is a process that many agencies go through. They then request a peer-reviewed site assessment and can ultimately gain accreditation through that. But again, there really is limited crossover from anything I've seen here about an accredited agency receiving any evaluation or improvements in their wildfire risk scores. And then kind of in closing here, just to talk about our renewed emphasis, really, I believe in the last decade in the fire service, about a holistic approach to community risk reduction. It used to be that we talked about fire prevention. That was kind of, we all had fire prevention divisions, the fire marshal, all those things. And so it was really more myopically focused on how do we prevent fires, or how do we investigate fires once they happen. But thankfully, while we are slow to change sometimes, I believe this focus on community risk reduction has been a real step forward in our evaluation of both education and prevention strategies. And I think it's really a springboard for us to work with the groups represented here and others to be a catalyst into the local communities. We're already doing that in health and wellness, things like fall prevention and other health risks in a given community. And I think we have done it historically in fire prevention strategies around structural fires, things like smoke detector campaigns, and those and the like. And so I believe that we are ripe and primed for doing those same kinds of partnerships here, that we could be a more proactive and engaged group. And the other part is that when the worst thing does happen, that ability to help with both response and recovery in a given community. Your fire service agencies are really valued members of those local communities and are often looked to as kind of subject matter experts or those who will be there long after the disaster is over as a part of that recovery. And so I think that is a strong point of the need for the relationships. And so I will just say that the partnerships, I believe, are the most key things. And because we are known and trusted in those local communities, we can be a great conduit for that communication and even program delivery. And I have heard several of the program presenters up to now in the last few weeks talk about partnering with local fire service agencies, but I think there is an opportunity to do more of that. I think anytime we have these programs that come in, I hope that the local fire service will be a primary go-to for the insurance industry and others to say, hey, we need to engage with those local fire departments. I think here at the state level, we need to be looking to make sure that those local fire departments are adequately resourced and that they are then able to be the effective kind of initial attack and kind of key community members that will help in many cases determine the overall outcome. The challenges that come with the lack of that coordination are what we've been experiencing. We get calls routinely from members of our community saying, hey, I thought I'd done everything right. I've been a part of some of these other mitigation strategies, and I just got either a non-renewal notice for my insurance, or I just got an exponential increase in the rates that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to cover. And so I think that is a challenge for all of us. And the ability to be at the table together and have these conversations will help us all be able to answer those more effectively and hopefully prevent them happening in the future. With that, I want to be sensitive to time and yield back to any questions.
Thank you, Steve. I want to start with a question that Senator Short put into the chat. Actually, Senator, would you like to ask it yourself? Oh, wait, we can't hear you though. Are you on mute?
Sure. Yep, there I go.
Yeah,
so yes, my brain wasn't thinking of the right thing, but Steve, thank you so much for your presentation. Living in a rural area and representing a rural area, our fire districts, whether they're volunteer or career or otherwise, man, they're on the front lines, and I just so appreciate that we have them. So two questions, and I think you kind of answered it throughout your presentation, but I really want you to highlight more about, we have districts that do have really good wildland fire capability because they've built it because they see that as a need in their community, but they're really not being recognized. Like there's no recognition from the structure, from insurance and that, to reflect that we have that, and that should be a benefit. And sorry for that long lead in, but do you see any of the information that you provided that is looking at that as an asset in our communities? And then the second one, I'm just curious about the water capacity that you have in each types of the firefighting vehicles that you showed us pictures of.
Oh, thank you. And I should have highlighted that. Let me start with that easier one first. So I'll start there. Yes, the typing, I mentioned those 7 types, and one of the components of those 7 types is how much water it takes or brings with it, and how much the capacity of the individual pumps. And so this really bridges to both questions, though, because and we fully admit that in some of the more rural environments, it is challenging to mount a significant staffing workforce in those first few minutes. And so the effectiveness of a very small force and being able to get into an area at the initial outbreak of a fire and effectively mitigate is critical, because if it gets beyond that initial suppression force, then we are looking at one of these multi-day potential conflagrations. So to your question, they can be as small as 150 gallons of water that they're carrying in pumps, at 50 gallons or less. But even those in a very small environment, a single property can be very effective in that initial attack and getting them put out. Up to those larger ones, those water tenders I think I mentioned can have 3,000 or more gallons of water on them, but your average of those larger engines are probably in the 300-gallon tank, 300 to 500 gallons of water that they're bringing with them. Again, it's hard when we think about it in the structural environment, though, that the fire hoses that we use to put out fires once it's inside a structure, the minimum those are putting out are usually 150 to 200 gallons of water a minute, and those can use up those tanks very quickly. Whereas in the wildfire arena, we're able to more strategically use that water and make it go much further. And there are other additives of things that we can use, like foam bases and other things in certain environments where it can even be more effective and really extend the coverage footprint of those what are seemingly small amounts of water that we have available. So it does vary widely, but yeah, somewhere between 150 and 1,000 gallons of water is likely to show up on one of those individual engines and then be able to be refilled by those tenders.
And then
right.
the second question, which is, are any of these survey and rating bureaus or the Centers for Public Safety Excellence, are any of these looking at firefighting, the wildland firefighting capability of our fire districts?
It's more cost effective. They're able to have some of these pieces of apparatus that are less costly to build, can be deployed by smaller numbers. We do have issues, unfortunately, that statutorily, and these are done for health and safety, so I'm not begrudging them at all. But to go in and effectively suppress a structure fire, there has to be a certain number of firefighters on scene with a certain level of capability and specialty equipment, because they have to have a certain number outside the fire to be able to be in a rescue force for those who are inside. Where in the wildfire arena, we can actually deploy and be aggressive with all of those initial attack resources to be right on the front lines of the fire and suppressing it. And so it's actually much more cost effective to be effective in your suppression in the wildfire arena. And that's better for those small rural districts who have less staffing. So I hope that helps. I will say that I'm encouraged to hear that hopefully we're looking for better mechanisms to assess these capabilities in the local communities. I just feel like that's a gap that exists today. So.
Thank you, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Cooterer.
Thank you. And thank you, Steve, for the presentation. I agree with Senator Short. It was very, very helpful. And I also want to tell you that I hear a lot from communities how grateful they are for the fire department and the firefighters and the fire chiefs. So thank you for all you do. So one of the things that this is a little different kind of question, but it goes to helping the consumer understand their overall fire risk. And I know there's a fire protection score, and then there's also a wildfire risk score. And I often hear people conflate the two. They don't necessarily understand what they are. And could you talk a little bit about how they're different, why they're important, and whether you believe that this is information? I know that some of it is the consumer may know the fire protection score, but not necessarily their wildfire risk score. Do you think that rating should be public knowledge for the consumer?
The short answer, and again, this is easy for me to say because I'm sensitive to the complexity that was expressed from the industry, but I think the short answer is yes, that transparency always helps when people are experiencing things like either non-renewal or rate escalation, that if they can understand the root cause of that is very helpful. And as you alluded to, Commissioner, we have had a longstanding practice of your protection class rating that here in Washington is assigned by the Washington Survey and Rating Bureau. You can call and get that. You can actually look at it and find it online at the parcel level. Now, again, we believe as the fire service, there are challenges with the way that score is assessed and that there are even ways that we can improve that. But I'm thankful we're working on that collaboratively with your office and others. But we don't think that there is the same transparency and consistency in the way that is derived from a fire service capability for the wildfire side. So long answer to your question, say yes. I think more transparency in that, more consistency would be helpful for everyone. And we are certainly willing to be participants in that. We would love to be at the table to have those discussions about how can we better highlight, share the resources, the capabilities of the local fire service, and then develop a mechanism where that can be considered.
Thank you. Kenton, over to you. Let's do one more question.
Thanks. And thanks, Steve. Great presentation. Thank you for the work of the fire service. I'm wondering, you spoke early in your presentation about and you alluded a little bit more to it later on, the gap between parcel level evaluation for wildfire risk score and community level. Could you speak a little bit more about how the fire service personnel or administration see what that gap is, so that we can sort of drill down into that as we think about mitigation?
Sure. Well, let me first say I would not at all take away from the importance of the individual parcel property owner role, because if you do everything right and the properties on either side of you don't, then you are absolutely at increased risk. I think what we see as a role that the fire service can play in that is actually being a conduit, because we're always in those communities to highlight that risk. To be when we're communicating, we're constantly at local community events, engaged with our communities, and having the resources provided of some of these programs where we can highlight why that is so important, I think is an area where we can certainly focus. Candidly, when a fire does break out, most of the time your local fire service officials already know those demographics at some level. They're in those communities all the time, and they know which ones are potentially savable or unsavable. And so they're going to focus those activities on what is a savable area. And so they're going to go in, apply their resources, and try to cut off a fire in an area where they believe they have the greatest likelihood to minimize both obviously property loss and risk to life. So it is an area of primary study, I know, for all your local fire jurisdictions, and I think an area of prime opportunity for us to partner together on getting the word out about why that's so important, to have not only the individual parcel level, but a holistic community approach to it.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to keep us moving. If you have further questions or comments for Steve, you can certainly put them into the chat if you're a panelist, and everybody can use the survey link that if you scroll up into the chat, you can see that Deanne has sent. I'll also send it out again after this call. Next, we're going to move to Shelby Flanagan and Michelle Fredrickson, spatial epidemiologist from the Department of Health. And the legislation that formed this work group mentioned the Department of Health's map. So we wanted to learn more about how that ties into our recommendations. And if you're looking at the survey, you will see that we switched the order at the very last minute. So the questions for these folks are a little bit farther down. So with that, Shelby and Michelle, over to you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'll be keeping my camera off due to internet issues today, but my name is Shelby Flanagan and I use she, her pronouns. Bear with me as I spent a fair amount of time on the East Coast like Steve and also talk very fast. I've had the privilege of serving as one of two spatial epidemiologists supporting the Environmental Health Disparities Map, often referred to as the EHD map at the State of Washington Department of Health, since June of 2022. I'm excited to be here with you today, share more about the EHD map and its applications, and I'm also joined by my wonderful colleague, Michelle Fredrickson, so I'll pass it over to her to introduce herself.
Morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Fredrickson. There it is. Morning, I'm Michelle Fredrickson. I am a spatial climate change epidemiologist, and I work primarily on our environmental health variables in the Washington Tracking Network data portal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the wildfire and wildfire smoke variables that we have available and what kind of information we have that might be relevant to this work group.
Thanks, Michelle. Our agenda for today starts with a brief background on the EHD map and how it relates to the HEAL Act. I'll then provide an update on our progress in version 3 plans, and then Michelle will discuss our wildfire smoke indicator and other resources available on the Washington Tracking Network. So the EHD map is the result of a 2-year partnership among communities, academia, and government occurring from 2017 to 2019, with the first version being released in January 2019 and the second in July of 2022. Front and centered, a coalition representing over 60 organizations advocating for communities of color across Washington organized community listening sessions to hear directly about environmental concerns, and these sessions were instrumental in shaping the EHD map. The feedback from these listening sessions, as well as a literature review, helped identify 19 indicators based on available data for Washington to include in the EHD map at the time. The 19 indicators fit into 4 themes, which were environmental exposures, environmental effects, sensitive populations, and socioeconomic factors. Washington's EHD map is based on a conceptual framework called a cumulative impact model, where the risk is threat multiplied by vulnerability. Threat, as is referred to here, is a combination of environmental exposures and effects, and vulnerability is made up of population characteristics that affect people's susceptibility to environmental pollution, including but not limited to socioeconomic factors and sensitive health conditions. The overall model generates a cumulative environmental health impact score for each census tract, which we refer to as the overall risk. The EHD map focuses on estimating this risk and does not incorporate assets or mitigation strategies into the model. The biggest strength of cumulative impact models is that they recognize different factors like social characteristics and environmental elements are linked together and don't exist in isolation. Cumulative impact models increase likelihood that disadvantaged communities receive critical attention. In 2021, the state legislature passed the Healthy Environment for All, or the HEAL Act, to address environmental and health disparities across the state. The act requires 7 state agencies to integrate environmental justice into their decision-making with a focus on identifying and supporting overburdened communities, typically defined as census tracts ranked 9 or 10 on the EHD map, or those containing tribal lands as identified by ecology. Under Section 19 of the HEAL Act, the Department of Health is responsible for maintaining and advancing the EHD map. That includes publishing technical documentation, supporting EHD map users, conducting a comprehensive evaluation every 3 years. The evaluation process involves incorporating new community and tribally informed indicators, adding overlays, refining methodologies, tracking changes between map iterations, expanding training materials, and providing consultation to state agencies to ensure the map remains a relevant and effective tool. The HEAL Act requires these agencies to incorporate environmental justice into the decision-making with a focus on identifying and supporting overburdened communities. And there are several places where the HEAL statute makes specific reference to the map. Those include the definition of an overburdened community, the environmental justice assessment section, and the EJ Council sections. So how are agencies using our map? As an example, the Washington State Department of Commerce commissioned a needs assessment to evaluate how energy efficiency services can better serve low-income households and overburdened communities, particularly in light of the state's 2050 decarbonization goals. They overlaid the Washington EHD map with their program impact mapping tool to identify which census tracts with an overall EHD rank of 8 or more were being reached by existing energy assistance programs. By doing so, they illuminated geographic gaps in service delivery and highlighted under-resourced, high-need communities that were receiving sufficient energy efficiency interventions. This guided their analysis and shaped targeted, equity-focused recommendations to scale services where they're most needed. Again, I want to emphasize that the EHD map is not a catch-all, but rather a starting point to be used in conjunction with additional data sets such as the Washington State Department of Commerce did here. In addition, the Washington State Institute for Public Policy compared the EHD map to similar tools in other states, as well as EJ Screen. In general, they noted that the strength of Washington tool being a cumulative impact tool, and that we used similar measures, methods, and data sources as other states using cumulative impact maps. They also highlighted measures within the report that other states included that Washington did not. We're updating methodologies for some of our indicators based on some concerns raised during the WSIPP review and from tribal staff and community partners. Based on conversations with ecology, we're changing the toxic risk from facilities measure to an air toxic risk measure, which estimates the cancer risk from breathing air toxics over many years. This will include harms caused by wood burning stoves and agricultural-related risks. This measure includes risk from diesel, but will exclude risk from wildfires since they're already included in other measures. Shown on the map is the draft updated lead risk from housing measure. This measure also has updated risk calculations. In collaboration with partners, we've also developed 8 new indicators across environmental exposure, socioeconomic factors, and sensitive populations, with a focus on rural concerns. At this point, these are proposed new indicators which reflect the priorities raised by tribal and community partners, and these additions work to mitigate the concern that existing indicators in the map only prioritize urban concerns. Shown on the map is the draft wildfire smoke exposure indicator. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michelle Fredrickson to discuss our wildfire smoke exposure measure and our EHD map topic pages, which could be a place to highlight prevention and mitigation on the topic. So I will hand this back to you, Michelle.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shelby. Let me go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, how do I do this in Teams? There we go. There's the share button. I usually use I'm usually a Teams user, not a Zoom user, so.
I think you got to just select the screen you want, and then at the bottom, double click the share button. Yeah.
Oh yes, double click. It's the double click that always gets me. Okay, are we all seeing my slides now? I see a thumbs up. Thank you, Kelly. So the first thing I want to talk about before I get into our specific wildfire smoke metric is the Washington Tracking Network, which is where our smoke metric lives. So the Washington Tracking Network is a public data portal that we work to maintain in the Office of Environmental Public Health. And this highlights spatial environmental data, the combination of health and environmental data to illustrate place-based relationships between environment and health. So we know that there's a very, very strong relationship between your overall health and well-being and where you live. And the data in the Washington Tracking Network explores that. So with regards to wildfire hazards, we're talking about, as everyone in this group will already know, we're talking about several hazards at one time for wildfire season. There's the fires themselves and the wildfire smoke. For the purposes of public health, wildfire smoke is often the more widespread hazard, since that has this very strong impact on a lot of health conditions that we monitor. So the data that we have available for wildfire season information on the Washington Tracking Network are the number of fires by census tract, the acres that are burned by census tracts. This is all historical data year over year since 2000. So these are very recently updated from 2000 through 2024 annually. The FEMA wildfire risk score, which I imagine we're all quite familiar with here in this group. And then our wildfire smoke cumulative score, which is what I'm going to talk about the most because that is our unique product that will be incorporated into the EHD map and is, if I do say so myself, pretty cool. So the wildfire smoke cumulative score is a historical wildfire smoke indicator capturing frequency and intensity of smoke events. So what this does is it generates a numerical score for each census tract based on how frequent and how intense their smoke events have been over time. And this is what that map tends to look like, with a higher score representing more smoke exposure. We use data from the Department of Ecology and from NOAA. We get a lot of data from NOAA's heavy smoke satellite imagery. That is, we use daily satellite imagery that is processed annually to examine smoke impacts over Washington state, and then to put that into a grid pattern and summarize it then into a census tract pattern. So here's an example of just like what one of those smoke products might look like. We get all of this data from NOAA satellite imagery. We also use air quality data from the Department of Ecology, and this goes into how we determine the different impacts of wildfire smoke versus just general poor air quality. So what we do is we identify all census tract days with a smoke plume intersection. So if we identify, when we have those smoke plume daily maps, we identify every census tract that intersects with that smoke plume during the months that are considered wildfire season. Typically, this is June through September. In 2022, this also included October because we had a very late wildfire season that year that lasted a long time. In addition to this, we assign to each census tract daily PM 2.5 concentration values from the nearest monitor for smoke impacted days. Then we sum this concentration on these smoke impacted days. We also calculate the median air quality level for just overall for non-smoke days for each area. And then we subtract that from the total score in an effort to sort of normalize it a little bit so that we're not seeing just a reflection of areas that are overly polluted in general. So we are seeing excess pollution that is happening on these heavy smoke days that would then presumably be able to be attributed to the wildfire smoke score. This total number gives us the cumulative smoke score. We do see a lot of the same communities over time that are affected by wildfire smoke. And a lot of these things do line up with our environmental health disparities map. In overburdened communities tend to be the ones that face the difficulties and the health impacts of wildfire smoke the most. So it gives us this unique information on how wildfire smoke has impacted communities over time. areas that were strongly impacted in the past are more likely to be at risk in the future. And so we recommend that this is a useful starting point for identifying areas that may be problematic in the future for health interventions, and using this as a base to get started on areas with census tracts that have a high score. So one last thing that I want to touch on, and we'll make sure we're being we're running through this really fast, but I want to make sure we're respecting everybody's time. And I know this is a busy group. I do want to talk about just how we incorporate additional context into our metrics, because like Shelby mentioned, it's hard to quantify mitigation efforts in such a way that we can build them into our statistical modeling. So we do try to address these types of things, like how to avoid exposure and how to mitigate your own risk for the public, for the purposes of public health, in our topic pages. So for a lot of our data, when we have a large amount of data, we will create like a data dashboard, and in these in the pages leading up to these dashboards, we have topic pages which describe what the risk is and then describe things like reducing exposure. So I have I've linked a couple of examples here, and just have one screenshot that I've shared here, just showing kind of an example of how we do that. Just both of the links here will take you to dashboards to view the data, but then we also have separate information about how to reduce your exposure. And this is more of where I think the mitigation information would fit in with our Department of Health products, since that is something that's a little difficult to build into our models. All right. Just want to share contact information. There's my email address, the email address for the EHD map team, and an email address for our air quality folks here at DOH.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And
just about
Shelby.
15 minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate it. If you have comments or questions for Michelle and Shelby, you can certainly put those into the chat. If you're in the working group, you can also use the survey link, which I will, if you can scroll up in the chat and see that link, or I'll send it to you after this call. Thank you both for joining us. I want to keep us moving to Matthew Deere. And Matt, tell me if I'm saying your name incorrect there.
You're saying it just fine.
Thank you. Lead wildfire meteorologist, Department of Natural Resources. Over to you.
All right, I'll share my screen here in 1 second. Okay, we should be seeing my screen now. Great. Yeah, I apologize for not having my video on. I am out on a wildfire assignment and I'm not looking quite as stylish as the rest of the presenters. So I thought this was still important meeting to keep. I was asked to give an update on the science and methodology behind our 6120 hazard and risk mapping here at DNR. So a couple of agenda items here, going to discuss what 6120 actually directs DNR to do, and then I want to talk about the methodology. I know that there's been quite a bit of discussion surrounding methodology of wildfire hazard risk mapping, etc. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our process and the work that we're doing. We're very much in the midst of creating this work, so there's not really any products to share, but wanted to touch on a bit of the work we're doing. So starting out, just the directives straight from the Senate bill to establish the wildfire hazard map and designate areas as low, moderate, high, and very high wildfire hazard. We were also directed to establish a base level wildfire risk map for each county of the state in coordination with the state fire marshal, and then designate vulnerable resources based on their exposure and susceptibility. Continuing onward, we were also directed to establish a method by which local governments may update these maps based on local assessments, which really is a key piece in this entire process between the stakeholder group that we're working with and the future goals for this product. And then lastly, publicly display the map and the criteria and analysis used. So on the right there, got a pretty simple and intuitive graphic from emergency management literature about the difference between hazard and risk. Hazard is just your wildfire. It's where do fires occur, and that risk is where we start talking about the socioeconomic component there. Where do people live? Where are structures at risk, etc. So the way that we are leaning towards doing this is with a tool called FSIM. It's a large fire simulator that was developed by the U.S. Forest Service and has been in use for over a decade. One of the key benefits here, and the graph on the right, you don't need to read too much into, it's just that there's been good verification data. We know how this model performs, where it does good, where it does bad. And that's just one piece that is missing from a lot of other more contemporary methodologies. They don't have that ground truthing. We've had FSIM being run and being used in wildfire hazard mapping from the U.S. Forest Service on a national scale for well over a decade. So we also have all of the required data sets, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And we do have the executable files to run this program. So we can run it at slightly higher resolutions than the national run and produce something really tailored for Washington. So I want to talk briefly about the input data sets. What are we looking at? What is the model considering when it's going out there and building its own fires, basically? So starting off, we need historic fire occurrence data. This points us to where fires ignite on the landscape. There's very, very good fire occurrence data going back to 1992. It's research grade stuff that's published by the Forest Service and updated every 2 years. And that's going to be another theme that you see throughout these inputs. All of them are readily updated on a pretty cyclical basis. So there's always new data coming in. It makes it very easy to keep things fresh and current. We also need historic weather and fire danger data. So big thing here is the map on the right is the fire danger rating areas for the Northwest Coordination Center. That's Oregon and Washington, our federal counterparts in the fire service. So each of those areas features similar climate, similar topography, similar vegetation. So a fire in that area is representative of that small region of the state. Things behave similarly, and we can expect pretty good, reliable weather data and fire danger data to be produced from just a single RAWS or a remote weather station in each of those locations. So taking a look at those and what fire weather do we see, what fire danger is typical, and then the model is able to pull from that. Finally, the fuelscape, again, another really great set of layers is available for this. There's both satellite derived data as well as ground truth data from some previous research efforts in 2018 and 2023. The PNW QWRA is what it's called. It was the Quantitative Wildfire Risk Analysis. It actually brought together quite a few fire experts from across the region, making sure that these fuelscapes do align with what we see out there on the landscape so that the model has the best available data and can most accurately predict what fires do over the course of many, many seasons. So where we're going with this, again, like I said, we're very much in the midst of this project. It is not something that has products associated with it yet. And when I said many, many seasons, FSIM, the simulation model, runs up to 1,000 wildfire seasons. Those are all not looking into the future. They're looking at current conditions right now and where do fires occur across those 1,000 seasons. So what areas burn at a higher rate? What areas burn with higher fire intensity? Those are the sort of things that the hazard map is going to be able to produce. The risk map relies completely on the outputs from the hazard map. You can't have risk without hazard. So we need to know first where that hazard is occurring. And then we're awaiting some clarification regarding some of the bill language, just trying to find where are these values at risk or what are the values at risk that we care most about that need to be on these maps. Lastly, I wanted to touch on the GIS and the mapping component here. This is not my section. I lead the modeling section for this project, but they're solidifying some of their methodology for how are we going to incorporate those local level assessments? What does that process look like? And then how are these maps hosted within the Washington DNR's internet portfolio? So I do apologize for the quick briefing. I am out on a fire assignment, and there's not a whole lot of products associated with this yet, but I'd love to answer any questions that there are about our methodology and some of our next steps.
Thank you. Questions or comments for Matt? Chandra.
Good morning, Matt. So in the availability of local jurisdictions to provide their own assessments and modifications, we here in Spokane have our mitigation coalition, and I would be looking to them to provide that. So are there outlines or guidance specifically how that local modification and information is going to be gathered?
Yeah, absolutely. That is really our goal with the final product here, is creating that streamlined approach for this is how it can be done, and done within the rules and regulations that have been set forth by the Senate bill. So we're working with a vast array of stakeholders from across the state, including David Forte, who's on this call from the Insurance Commission office. So there will be a pretty clear rubric for how we want to see modifications made.
Thank you. Senator Short.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So as a follow-up to that, are the stakeholders that you're involving, like, are they also going to be like some of our rural local governments and things like that may be participating in how you develop how you develop the use of the information?
Yeah, absolutely. So my supervisor, Angie Lane, is leading up our stakeholder group. And I don't want to exactly speak to who's involved and whatnot, but it's a vast array of folks from across the state representing all sorts of different agencies, jurisdictions, both urban and rural, in the state of Washington. In wildfire, Eastern Washington is always top of my mind as a wildfire meteorologist. And I think that Eastern Washington tends to not get quite as lost in the conversation as perhaps on some other topics, because wildfire, it is a very, very severe and significant hazard for Eastern Washington in particular. So it is a big focus of this project.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Thanks. Hi, Matt. Jenny Coe with the Conservation Commission. I just have a question. How will these future maps integrate with the existing WUI map, the Wildland Urban Interface map that DNR currently has?
Right. So there's been some pretty significant discussion about that in our stakeholder meetings. I don't want to go too deep into it, but these are standalone products. So the WUI map is based just on where are structures in the forest land, and this map is based on where wildfires occur most often across the landscape. So there is a bit of a distinction there.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
David.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Appreciate you jumping on while you're in the field. And just for Senator Short, a little bit of clarification. There is a lot of participation in the group that Angie Lane is leading with building officials, local fire marshals, and they really is a great group providing good input about how local authorities can provide their input, because they're there in their communities and using the information that these maps are going to produce. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. Anything else for Matt before we let them get back to the fire? Of course, if you have other comments or questions, you can include those into the survey. Matt, thanks for making time to connect today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move to Joanne Pearson, State Geographic Information Officer, Washington Technology Solution. Joanne, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me make sure is everything looking okay? Good. All righty then. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to present to this work group. I think it's great to really be able to get to understand a lot of the things going on with wildfire from so many different directions and so many different perspectives. So I really appreciate being here to be able to represent maybe some of our digital side of that as well. So I am the State Geographic Information Officer. I work here at WATEC, the IT department for Washington State. And in that role, I'm all about geography and using geography to make business decisions. And as we've already heard from several of our presenters today, and I think in some of the other work groups as well, where a lot of these things are, where people, where habitat, where ignition points, things like that, all come down to geography. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk a little bit about data sharing platforms that we already have at the state and maybe how we might be able to leverage some of that into this work. And if anytime you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand or do a chat, and I'm definitely interested in making sure that we handle any questions that come up. So I'm not really sure what everybody's background is, so I thought I'd just start with a few quick slides about what is GIS. So Geographic Information Systems is how we model the world in digital platforms. And actually so many of our agencies do it, DNR, Department of Health, many others are also doing this. And it's basically looking at various information and modeling the real world, but being able to do it digitally at our desk. And with so much more power on computers, this really makes it even so much, I won't call it easy because of all of the work that it goes into it, but it does make it more accessible to so many of us, and being able to do the models like the EDH or some of the wildfire mapping and modeling that Matt was just talking about. So what does GIS look like? Well, actually, it can look like a lot of different things. The Department of Natural Resources, they come up with our high resolution elevation data, looking at rivers and streams in that top right-hand photo. Also, it can look like an imagery and aerial imagery that is correctly located in the world. That purple, I don't know if you can quite see the purple square, but that is the WATEC building in Olympia. This can be very helpful for looking at buildings, structures, vegetation, and we often use it as a backdrop for some of the other information that we have. And then the one on the right-hand side, I think is kind of an interesting one of it. It's marine mammals monitoring data that the Department of Transportation has, because when we are doing ferry terminal work, we need to be monitoring where the marine mammals are. We're in their environment, making an awful lot of noise. And so we monitor their locations and then report that back up to NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And so all of this is taking place within GIS. And so it has a mobile component potential to it. And it also has desktop analysis and reporting components to it. So it's more than just data, but a lot of it is data. And I like to think of it as just adding geographic perspective to what we already have. We might have information in a spreadsheet by county, but then we can take that information and put it on a map and look for patterns. And so even data that might look tabular in nature, if it's listing counties, if it's listing addresses, if it's listing things like that, then it can be visualized spatially, and we can look for different patterns across our state. One of the things that I always really like about geography is that it's really very personal. It's where we live, it's our communities, it's our neighborhoods, and when they're threatened by things like wildfire, it becomes even more important to understand that power of place and that all parts of our state are extremely important. And so one of the things that I'm always looking at is making sure that we're mapping all parts of our state equally, that we have enough attention on all of the information that is available, and that we share that information statewide. I thought I'd go through 2 examples of how we do this here in Washington State, and just 2. There's like a million. I could take up the entire rest of this presentation and work group just talking about all the great things that we're doing here in Washington, but I'm going to talk about 2 of them specifically. So one of them is that we have a lot of cross-agency collaboration with data, because as you can imagine, a lot of this information can be quite expensive actually to collect, to maintain, or whatever. And so we don't want all of our agencies doing that separately. We really want everybody to be able to share that information seamlessly across all of our agencies, and in fact, with local government, with tribal nations, and with the feds. And so this example is where we're protecting students and drivers through better signage. So we have a cross-agency collaboration between the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. They know where bus stops are for our K through 12 students. DOT is responsible for signage along our state roads and highways for where those bus stops are. And then that information gets shared. I mean, it's sensitive information to know exactly where the bus stops are, because there could be children there that are unmonitored during known parts of the day. So we have set up a data sharing platform that allows them to share that information into a centralized location here at WATEC. And then DOT comes in and has permission to get that. And then they use their mobile maintenance crews and mobile applications to be able to look and see where these bus stops are. And then they can compare that to where they have put signs on the roads and see which ones need to be adjusted, added, removed, things like that. And so that is a way that we can share information in native environment, native format, so that OSPI shares it to WATEC. DOT comes in and grabs it and then compares it with the other information that they have about it. And it allows us to share some sensitive information. This isn't PII, this isn't that level of sensitivity, but it is not considered by OSPI to be available completely to the public. And so that helps us use the most updated information. OSPI updates their information once a year about those bus stop locations, and DOT has to coordinate signage, maintenance crews, et cetera, to be able to update them so they'll be able to get it into their workflow and know that they're using the most recent information about it. So that's one way that we use the data sharing platforms. Another one is hazard mitigation, and this is actually where we had an opportunity to collaborate with OIC and many others with the Emergency Management Department up at the military, and basically looking at hazard mitigation and wildfire insurance. So where is existing structures? Which structures or areas have insurance coverage? And how can we share this information in a matter that is sensitive to the insurance industry, to people whose homes might be at risk? Like I said, geography is very personal. And then how can we help use this information to mitigate across all of our different agencies? And it can be really quite sensitive to be able to look at this economic resilience and recovery from wildfire. So there's not only sort of where it is and where do we fight it and how to do the mitigation measures that some of the previous speakers talked about, but also what about the recovery afterwards and being able to report that information. And certainly insurance and other things play a part into that. And you may not think of insurance as something that is mappable, but in fact it is. And looking at coverage and which providers provide coverage. That actually was hard to share prior to, I think about a year or two ago. There was some data sharing that was allowed for OIC to collect some of that information. And so it's really nice to be able to see this come full circle and that we can start to use this information combined with some of our other data from other state agencies. So how do we do that? Basically, all of our agencies collect and maintain their own data. So DOT is in charge of our roads and highways. Department of Ecology is actually in charge of our rivers and streams. DNR is in charge of a lot of our forest cover areas. Fish and Wildlife has salmon. And actually every agency has a variety of things. Department of Health has environmental health disparities, along with a whole lot of other information. So each agency gets to control their own information, and then they share it up. So that middle tier, where it's the geo.wa.gov and the geo portal, that is where WATEC steps in. So that information from the agencies are then shared into those two standardized platforms, depending on the category of data. If it's open to the public, it goes to geo.wa.gov. If it has some level of sensitivity, it goes to GeoPortal. What that allows us to do is have a layer of authoritative geospatial data that can be referenced and integrated into our other state systems. Sometimes those are systems that don't initially have spatial information, but maybe would need to have county boundaries from the Department of Natural Resources. Maybe they need to have address correction, which is something that we get by partnering with our 911 public safety answering points. They're the ones that control the address data, share it up centrally, and then we're able to use that across the state. But we are able to integrate with these other systems. And so the concept is that we want to keep things as consistent as possible. The data is controlled by the agencies that know it best. It's probably fairly obvious about the benefits of centralized data platforms, but just to kind of review that, and I'm talking about the GIS, the geographic data, but actually we have a similar process here in place at WATEC for non-spatial data to be able to centralize that information and to be able to share it out as well. But it does allow us to have data security and privacy standards, for sure, efficiency and reduced redundancy, because what we don't want is all of the agencies to have to store this information separately. Some of it can be in the terabytes of data, and we don't want that to be replicated across all of these different agencies that might need it. It also levels the playing field for smaller agencies. Our Arts Commission actually does have a little map of where our public art is, but they can also leverage some of the other information that is available from our other state agencies. And it goes on, but it does allow us to solve these highly complex challenges statewide, such as wildfire mitigation, other hazard mitigation, and any type of problem or challenge that we have at the state that requires multiple agencies, which is really, I think, most of them. I always really like GIS because it's about the business. GIS is very much of an applied. I mean, we saw it with the meteorology, we saw it with the environmental health disparities. So it really is a foundational piece of how Washington does business. And that is one of the things that I've always liked about GIS and what really has attracted me into this profession. And that I'm so happy to be able to serve the state of Washington in this capacity. I guess what I would like to just emphasize is that we don't necessarily need a different or new platform to be able to do this data sharing. We can invest in what we already have. We already have data sharing and infrastructure in place. We have others that are starting to be developed. And then also, this is a process that's already understood. There's a governance process around our geographic information at the state, and we usually get about 30 to 40 agencies participating in that process. And so it's definitely a widely known, although I will say that not every part of every agency understands that part of it, right? And so that's part of this communication aspect of it. And that kind of brings me to the conclusion of the presentation, but I was wondering if there are any questions or anything that we'd like to discuss about sort of this data that we use, that we rely on, but can be a little bit unique. It isn't the firefighting trucks, but it is where these things are.
Thank you. Nothing in chat yet, Joanne. David, over to you for a question.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly, and thank you, Joanne. It's pretty clear how state agencies have the ability to use these platforms, share information to help each other. We heard from Steve earlier today of maybe some of the importance for local fire districts, maybe to understand what the state is seeing for risks, or even if there was mitigation effort uploaded into it. Do you have obstacles at all that you can identify that would prohibit your open platform from being able to be used by local fire districts if we were able to maybe show where the mitigation work is being done?
Sure. I think that's such a great question. So if it's open to the public, then that would go out on geo.wa.gov and that would be available. And in fact, that is used very heavily by our local partners to be able to receive information from the state that the agencies are sharing out there. If it's considered sensitive information, then probably we would need to put together a different platform that would be very similar to GeoPortal 2.0, except that it would allow more streamlined and efficient data sharing with local government and tribal agencies. And that is something that is certainly on our roadmap. I know in these budget times, it's kind of a challenge to do some of that type of investment, but those are some of the things that we have imagined. I think that if the need was there, I'd like to talk about it because there's sometimes different opportunities that I'm not always aware of. How can we get authentication? The big thing is actually authentication and security. And so I would need to bring others into that conversation, but I always think there's opportunity to at least learn and plot out kind of what we could do. And having a business need is what really I think drives these types of projects forward, not just sort of dreaming up ideas of what might be nice, but to really have something that we need to implement and put together. So yeah, I think that's a great question and definitely something that is near and dear to me as well.
Thank you. Senator Saldana.
Thank you all for the presentations. I think you started speaking to this a little bit in terms of if you were to, in terms of the data sets where there may be personal identifying data or data that, our residents have, given to the state for certain purposes, how you would go about in terms of partnering with locals or federal or other institutions, like what is the what are the protections for that data and making sure it stays that it's protected and that it's being used properly.
Sure, I think that's a great question. Most of what we have doesn't have personally identifiable information, and in fact, and we do have agencies that do that in a GIS environment. For example, DSHS is probably the one that is easiest to imagine, and Department of Health to a certain extent. But that is why the agencies are really in charge of that part of it. I actually ask, request, demand that they don't share anything that is not public information that should not be shared. And so there is nothing out on these platforms that changes any of that. If we wanted to do a more broader category 4 data sharing, so that PII, sensitive personal information, in some cases, demographics could also kind of fit into that sensitive data as well, not just about the person, but characteristics and things like that. We would need to have a whole nother different large conversation about how that gets implemented, particularly when there's data sharing involved. It's not that that doesn't happen. Our HHS coalition agencies do work together on a lot of these types of things, but in terms of the GIS perspective, that hasn't been there. Now, I will say that there are a couple of methods that we have been using and looking to use at the state, actually in combination with DSHS and Department of Health, where we basically geographically anonymize data. So instead of having like the address point of perhaps something, that we summarize it to a slightly larger geographical area. County is usually too large. You can think of census boundaries, but actually in our rural areas of Washington, census tracts and stuff are way too large still to understand sort of those patterns that we're looking for. And so there are a couple of other methods that we've been looking at and evaluating. I wouldn't do that by myself, but I do help facilitate a lot of that technology. But DSHS and those that are much more familiar with that type of processing are obviously extremely involved in that. And they're the ones that are interested, because if we can geographically anonymize it to make it to a larger area, that might make it data shareable and still might make it useful for planning. It obviously isn't the same thing as the specific services for a specific person, but can we look at patterns or something like that? And that is, I believe, still possible, but we're really only starting to put our toe in the water on that particular aspect of it at this point. But I do believe geography offers us that opportunity to anonymize.
Thank you. Kenton.
Sorry, I had a hard time unmuting. Thanks for your presentation. That was super informative. And I'm wondering, as we think again about the work that we're assigned to do here in terms of providing recommendations to the legislature, could you just put you on the spot a little bit, but could you kind of provide your own sort of vision about how data that your agency develops could inform like efforts to create a mitigation grant program? How these could be, what's the best way that the information that you have developed and continue to develop could inform drilling down to the sort of community level, looking at risk mitigation for wildfire?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. So basically, I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. I mean, I would kind of emphasize that there are a few data set layers that WATEC is responsible for. So like imagery, um, although the funding for that is a little bit in question right at the moment. And then we do a couple of other data sets that we aggregate at the statewide level, but actually most of this comes from our agencies. And so we host the platforms for them. So as an example, our hazard mitigation group up at the emergency management department, they come together and they have a plan that they do every, I think it's 5 to 10 years with FEMA, and they look at hazard mitigation, not just wildfire, although that is one of them, and as well as geological hazards, other types of hazards. And so the concept actually is that GeoPortal 2, the one that can handle category 2 and category 3, which you could also consider like draft data, data could be shared there, and that all of the folks within a particular work group, like geology hazards, or wildfire hazards, things like that, could all go in there and start to see the information together to kind of do checks and balances to make sure that, oh, how are we using the correct data? Does anybody know about something else that is more relevant? Like I mentioned, the local government we would need, and tribal government, which I think is another important piece of this, is how to share that effectively. When we first looked at this a few years ago, when we developed the GeoPortal product, there wasn't a great way to authenticate in if it wasn't within state government network. Perhaps that has changed, or perhaps we need to have another platform to be able to facilitate that. I mean, when I think of data and I think of how big, and I think of the investment at local government, it makes sense to be able to share it. And it makes sense to be able to share it in a way that allows all of us to use it for local government to be able to get what the state has, for the state to look at what the local government has. We have 39 counties. That's a lot of different ways to potentially do something. So having a nice standardized platform, I think, could really help with that. And there's a lot of examples of how that can be done. Actually, Department of Transportation has an example of how they're using community input in some of the GIS tools, but we would want to do that on, I think, a little bit larger level. So I don't know that I quite answered your question. I danced around it a little bit, but I actually have some ideas and plans, and I definitely think there are ways that we can handle this. And we also need to work very collaboratively with local government because they all have their own scenarios as well in terms of technology, responsibilities, type of data. And so it would be a fair amount of effort to kind of understand that and make sure we're hitting the mark. But yeah, we have the outline of it right now that we're doing for state agencies. And the goal was always get our open data in line, get this category 2 and category 3 data in line in terms of how to share it at the state agencies. And then third, is it category 4? I'm not sure, but how do we get to local government, tribal governments? Like that was sort of the next step. So prove out each phase, make sure that it works, and then move to the next one so that we can build on success.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne. And I will keep us moving.
Yes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was really nice to be here.
Thank you. Frank Freeval, Director Wildland Urban Interface Fire Institute, California Polytechnic University, St. Louis Obispo. Frank, over to you.
All right, thank you. Excuse me, thank you very much. I want to make sure is that slide coming up on your side.
Looks like it. Yes, now we see it.
Okay, very good. Well, first of all, I got to tell you, I've used a lot of ink listening to the excellent information today. Really impressive, the work going on in Washington. So I was asked to provide some information about our work with the Insurance Institute for Business Home Safety, and then a little bit about how we're approaching, just like you are, how do we integrate all these kind of competing issues into a system. So we'll jump right in. So we have a number of projects we've done with IBHS. One of them actually includes Washington. This project started back in 2022, and I think we're into roughly our last year on this project. Started out with 5 states and has expanded a little bit, but it's Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Idaho, and I apologize, I'm looking at this other screen. Idaho, Colorado, and Arizona. And essentially that project is about seeing if in each of those states we can align the insurance trades as they choose to organize in that state, the insurance commissioner's office, the state fire chiefs association, and the state association most closely associated with WUI codes, to see if we can align those 4 stakeholder groups around a common set of evidence-based mitigations. I mean, the way I got started in this work as a local fire chief, I started back in '79, but my last assignment in a high WUI area, I had some property owners pass a defensible space inspection of ours, pretty garden variety, nothing special about it, and got a non-renewal notice from their insurance carrier within the same week for too much wildfire risk. And so just as you've shared today, I realized we had a pretty significant disconnect there that we have to resolve. So that's one project. Another one is Rancho Mission Viejo Development Project. This is a large master plan community. Came out of the ground with under a very, very stringent WUI code, but the state of understanding the WUI peril from a modeling standpoint, an actuarial standpoint, was unable to capture the kinds of mitigations that this new development had done. And they called us because they could not sell the properties that were newly built under a strict code because they couldn't get insured. And so again, another pretty stark example of a disconnect between the mitigations on the ground and how we recognize those. I took with us, I requested, this person doesn't work directly for IBHS, but they're recognized by IBHS as a qualified inspector of their mitigations. I don't know if any of you would have seen this, but there were some terrible wildfires down in Chile in February of 2024. Over 100 people lost lives. They lost, I think, it was 14,000 affected structures, something along that line. And we wanted to go and look at this one community, 90 structures in the middle of everything, and the wind didn't stop blowing. They all survived. And so we went to go look at that through the lens of the IBHS wildfire prepared home mitigations. Helped with some input on the outdoor separation structure experiments. It's a joint effort with IBHS and National Institutes for Standards Technology. Also worked with IBHS on an executive discussion for wildfire risk, resilience, and insurance that had a number of stakeholders, including APCIA, the U.S. Fire Administration, a number of state fire agencies, and obviously IBHS itself. We realized that we have a lot of risk on the campus I'm at. We're located in Central California, the Central California coast, and we can't have much legitimacy if we're not practicing the mitigations that we're recommending. And so we're using our campus, several portions of our campus, as a pilot to apply the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home Neighborhood Standard, which is a broader version of the Wildfire Prepared Home Standard. And subsequent to that work, the Chancellor's Office for the CSU system, there's 23 campuses. They recognize they have at least 12 with elevated wildfire risk, and have asked us to extend this pilot to those other campuses. And again, that's using the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Neighborhood Standard, which is the next one there. In general, one of the things I would share is that I think one of the points of causing us challenge and confusion is that right now we're looking at each individual property through 4 risk lenses. Now, for a long time, we've looked at them through ignition resistant lens. So these are all things about how to not have your individual home burned down from exposure to a wildfire. Those kinds of approach has been around for a long time. I think Jack Cohen's work out of the Missoula Fire Lab, U.S. Forest Service Missoula Fire Lab, really did the work we're standing on regarding recognition of embers as the primary cause for that. I tend to think of 2017 as a hinge point in the insurance industry, where I call everything before that kind of legacy thinking. The number of financial losses, life losses, property losses, beginning in 2017, we'd had them prior, but the steady drumbeat of frequency and severity of these types of WUI conflagrations, legacy thinking won't resolve that. And so we started having the insurance industry look a lot more closely at the wildfire, specifically the WUI peril, because up to that point, it was a distant third, to wind, water, flood, those types of natural catastrophes. And that has changed. In the process of doing that, as we're looking at what we would recommend between ignition resistance and linking that to risk transfer, we've discovered that we're bumping up against some fairly longstanding other regulatory compliance risk policies. In general, I think of these as housing related, specifically to density, and then also some portions of energy policy, energy efficiency, with, say, windows, with vinyl components. And so we're discovering that some of these things that we've been complying with in those realms for good reason are actually counter to some of the risk mitigation and ignition mitigation principles that we need to follow. So that's obviously causing some confusion. And the combination of this lack of alignment on the same piece of property is, as I'm sure a number of the people on this call are aware, it's starting to create some political risk, because understandably our constituents, I know mine in Mammoth Lakes, it's right at my situation, they called me up as the supposed fire professional, and I couldn't explain to them why we had that disconnect. And that's about 5 years ago now, but it is very hard to push these types of, I love the Joanne's statement that geography is personal. It certainly is. And so as we're trying to apply these prescriptive measures for these other reasons, it's obviously bumping up against, very specific personal property decisions. And I don't think we've made that case with enough clarity yet. So we're getting a lot of pushback. And it's not just in California. I can tell you that in the 7 states that we're doing this work, everybody is unique, but there are some definite common trends across those. And so I think we have to understand and accept these 4 risk lenses and figure out how we get these aligned. Our approach to that alignment is to do the following. We want the best fire science research on heat transfer in the WUI. We lose these properties initially through ember ignitions, multiple ember ignitions, as Steve Brooks mentioned earlier. The system's designed to handle 1, maybe 2 structure fires at a time. When we get multiple ignitions under high wind, low humidity conditions, once you get multiple ignitions on structures, that whole response becomes overwhelmed even on the fire side, but it rightfully pivots to life protection. And so this is evacuation routes, saving lives. So we need the best fire science on heat transfer in the WUI, driving the best WUI property loss catastrophe modeling. The state of that modeling, as opposed to the wildfire propagation modeling, is way behind. I know it'll irritate some of the proprietary modelers, but what I'm hearing from the insurers and the reinsurers is they have a low level of confidence in our current understanding on how to model the propagation of structure to structure fire spread. Once we get that resolved, we can now place the proper evaluation and prioritization of risk within communities. They don't all have the same levels of risk. They do vary. So we need to be able to identify that and value it. As you've heard from Joanne and some others, that then starts to drive the architecture for pre-fire data collection and use. An immediate benefit, again, going back to Steve's point, is that if the first response had more granular data about the mitigation worked on each parcel level, and indeed in the community, we can put scarce resources on time, on target during the initial attack. And most of these losses occur in the first 12 hours. So it matters. You've got to go with just a little bit more than what's in your back pocket, but not a lot. You can't wait for, help the next day. A lot of times these are pretty well advanced. And so you would start to have information on where you have your best bet. You also know where your worst risks are in terms of evacuation and life safety. So having that data available just there, we don't even close this continuous improvement cycle, there's a huge benefit right there. But to me, where the real magic in this comes in, and this process is the result of some colleagues and I spending a lot of time with the stakeholders in the space, insurance commissioners, insurance regulators, reinsurance companies, public policy, fire practitioners, pretty robust group. Where this really comes into its own is when we do the post-fire reconstruction, the after-action reviews. If we know what mitigations were present or absent, and we can deconflict firefighting responses, and there's a way to do that, we'll start to redefine the best fire science on heat transfer in the WUI. And to me, that's the key. Now, when we went through this, we realized that there are 5 enabling tasks to make this process a reality. So one is we need a core set of mitigations that matter. I'll be the first one to tell you that fire science is incomplete. And I'll also tell you that there's more than enough there for us to get started. We'll know more in 5 years than we know now. But every year we wait today to get started, guarantees we'll have future communities that will not receive the benefit from that. And so I've provided some examples in here you can review later. One of the struggles is we have probably the better end of maybe 10 right now, different mitigation packages from places that actually have standing in this discussion. Some of them are professional standards, some of them are best practices, some of them are regulations, but they're not aligned. And so understandably, we're not sending an aligned message. As you heard me say, we need structure spread modeling. This link to this paper recently came out. I think it's a really good summary on the state of structure modeling. And I think you'll see that there's kind of a dearth of that capability right now. Several of you asked this question. We recognize the same thing, is that the systems they don't know how to differentiate capacity and capability of different types of resources in that first response. And so we created a pilot for something called a WUI response rating. And it really looks at capability and capacity of resources in 3 fire pathways: vegetation to vegetation, which you think of it as typical wildfire, last half mile or closer to the community; the vegetation to structure pathway, which is a donut, it goes about 100 feet out of the vegetative landscape that will carry fire, and about 2 layers of homes deep inside of the community itself. That is a key area for the initial response. It's going to pick up your ground fuels and connected fuels. Embers are going to go over the top of everything. And then in the structure to structure side, which is obviously the modeling piece, we need a WUI data commons. There's no way to understand the presence of these, their efficacy over time, unless we develop the systems where we can both collect agnostic to source, where we can collect data at scale on the parcels, start to pull that into the community level, and then make that available outward in both modeling, pre-planning, et cetera. We have to get this WUI data commons piece solved. There are ways to go about it, get some references there. Then the last one, which is probably the most important, is we've got to break down the barriers to social support for implementation and maintenance of these mitigations. And I think a huge piece of that is getting beyond our mixed messaging, where it's not intentional. Nobody's doing this on purpose. It's almost like we're in policy and research VFib right now. Tremendous amount of activity, all trying really hard, but we lack an effective heartbeat in both our research and our policy. It's getting better, but we're not there yet. I don't know about you, but when I try to stack up a bunch of skinny books or magazines on a bookshelf, they don't stay up there for me. And that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get the set of mitigations up and maintainable. And the only way, and I thought about this a long time, and it's usually going from one failed idea to the next, so it's not any great foresight, but just iteratively have come to the conclusion that we have to have these evidence-based mitigations. We can't do what's convenient or easy and think that's going to succeed. We have to do what the science and the ground truthing, to use Matthew's term, I love the ground truthing concept. We have to mercilessly evaluate the mitigations that are working or not. And then we've got to hold them up between public policy and private sector practice. If we don't do that, we're going to lose one of the bookends and we're not going to be successful. And so we have to get aligned in that space. If we don't do that, I fear we're just going to, we'll be further down the road in time, money, and effort, but we will have made no real advancements on getting to alignment. And the last thing I'll share before turning it over to Q&A here is, as you all know, but I just want to say it so we're eyes wide open on it, is that the willingness of an individual community to invest in mitigations is usually highest either right after or very close to, both in time and geography, a major WUI conflagration. And we've all been at this a long time. You know that it doesn't matter if it's COVID, the Ukraine war, inflation. There's always something else that's going to dilute the agenda space of what we think is most important. And you never get to schedule it. But what we find is there's a series of time periods where there are higher levels and lower levels of willingness to put time, treasure, and talent towards mitigations at the expense of other community needs. The elected officials on the call will know that there's always more need in communities than we have resources for. And so you have to, so we're going to continually ride this peak and valley experience between trading off those resources. And they're always going to be punctuated by events we can't schedule. And so the way to bring down the difference in those peaks and valleys is through an iterative continuous improvement process where we start to shrink the distance between the points of departure in our policies and best practices, and most importantly, the messaging to the public, which should be driven by the findings from research and after action reviews. So to me, those are really the key sort of overhead principles on how we advance mitigation packages. Right now, I believe the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home and Neighborhood Standards are the best articulated and evidence-based mitigation packages that are out there. But I think there are other things to look at as well. We'll know more in a few years than we know now. But if I had to point to something right now today, and I have for the last few years, to me, that is the path forward. But we have to get these other elements I mentioned, or we won't be able to continue that evolution over time. So I'll end it there and do my best to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Frank. Senator Short, you want to get us started?
Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, Frank, phenomenal information and perspective and all of the above. And so I've been a legislator for a while, especially local government, land use policy, and all of that. So, and I represent a very rural, sparsely populated district. We have, like populated town population centers. But my brain went to what you were saying when a lot of our growth management, like our planning policies and where you allow homes, all of how you site homes in a rural district, they generally want not only a small house footprint, but also a small landscape footprint, which means you have minimal disturbance of the land around you, which seems to be counterproductive with what you're talking about in terms of, those initial ignition sources. So, if you can, talk about that. The second piece, in your 4 risk lenses, that was super interesting from the standpoint, and I'm going to just, call it what it is. Is the lack of alignment or disconnect an industry that wants everybody to accept 100% of the risk? Because it seems like, we can, it seems like what you've done are some phenomenal pilots and things like that to really showcase what communities can do to really significantly reduce that risk, but it doesn't seem to be good enough, kind of a thing. In your work, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot if it does, is it really trying to get at that 100% risk, reducing 100% of the time before an industry will consider, insuring?
Great questions, and obviously you have earned a lot of calluses in the roles you've been filling. These are very informed questions. So 2 points on the planning piece. We can do this if we can get across, especially on the internal side, planning, development, review, those types of things. We can design communities and I think meet actually some of these other competing needs, but we have to be fully aware that they exist. And if we just try to shout over the top of them or marginalize them or skip them, no resolution. You may win that day, but we lose what our primary role is, to protect the community. So we have to, I think we're all going through a little bit of denial here on how things are, and we need to go past that and the anger and the bargaining and get into solving things. Regarding the 100% solution, I try to tell people I don't work for the insurance industries. That's not my specialty. I've had to back into it because I think it is one of the bookends without our permission. So we need, unless we're going to pay cash for everything or barter to neutrality, there will always be some form of surety on all economic activity. So we have to have robust, healthy, sustainable risk transfer markets. Now, part of the reason, it's time what we got here. Let me try this real quick. I'm going to do share screen again. This is one guy's opinion on why and how trying to get to your question, the 100% and why we're missing it. Oops, I'm sorry. Can you see the screen? It's got a bunch of little houses and square. Okay. So Frank's back in the napkin. We know how to bring fire into the community. That's what this part is. This over here is it's a wind rose. It's just a way it shows you, hey, you got prevailing winds that are strong and dry. Every community's got a profile that these come from. It's not up 360 degrees. So we know how to do this. Matthew did a great job on the meteorology side explaining that. For the longest time, I'm going to zoom in here. For the longest time, we would look at individual structures from the ignition assessment standpoint, right? This is where a lot of times your local fire service would come in, and we're looking at the structures from that perspective, pre-17. Once we started losing far more structures to conflagrations than the risk models from the risk transfer industry were indicating, they then started taking a much higher interest and would also look at the same property now at a much higher level. And to my surprise, happened to me too, right? On Monday, I said it was great. And on Friday, they said it was unacceptable. So these, obviously I showed these other 2 risk lenses. To me, the only way we get around this is to do the following. Having a hard time. This is a new program for me. One of my students is dragging me out of the Luddite phase and into some other tools. So right now, if if the polygon, the physical polygon for insurance company to make a portfolio decision covers multiple homes, what happens in the individual home is very predictable right now. If you were insurable last year, but now you're non-renewed, the property owner asks two predictable questions. What changed? Especially if they can't see anything nearby them. It's a pretty rational question. They don't understand that these decisions are made at a portfolio level. And usually these chunks have two kind of trigger points. Either there's too much concentration of risk. The insurance company doesn't want to do a bunch of adjacent physical policies. The other one is if there's too much wildfire risk. And in that case, when you ask that question, why am I uninsurable? A lot of times the ground level insurance person they may not see these models. They may not know why their algorithm tells them you can't write there. It depends a lot on the insurance company. Then the second question you ask is, well, what can I do to be insurable? And I heard from one of the other members mention they did all this work, did exactly what they were told at the individual level, and we're still not written. And I think it is embedded in the portfolio space geographically being larger than the structure. And so it causes a disconnect. So the way we're looking at approaching this is that we first need to bring over a WUI data commons, which means that each of these properties now would you'd be able to collect the data on the mitigations that matter. And then what we want to do is we want to drop those mitigations into WUI propagation modeling. We've done this on the wildland side. We've got multiple fuel types. We know what kind of mitigations disrupt the pathways, drops intensity, et cetera. We need to do that inside the built environment where the structures of the primary fuel type starts as a wildfire, but that's not what it is after it gets going from one structure to the next. And so when we can start to model pathways inside of the community based on parcel level granular data, now we'll be able to make alignment on those. Plus we'll know, I think what we're going to discover is that not every property inside a community faces the same kind of risk. And so those are the things that we're working on. I know that's a really 80-mile-an-hour drive-by, but that's the way I'm approaching it. Some other colleagues and I are approaching it to try to get those things aligned. I hope I answered your question. I know.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I won't take any more of your time. It generated a whole lot more, but that's okay. But just really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you, Senator. Any other questions for Frank? David.
Thanks, Frank. Just a great presentation and conversation. You were starting to kind of get into burdens of or responsibilities of each sector, maybe. So you got local government, state government, insurance companies, property owners, building industry. How is the conversation going in California as they're farther along in their crisis here? Are those conversations ongoing? Have they stalled? Is there anything that we should be thinking about as this work group needs to actually have some conversations about burdens for each sector?
That's a great question, David. And so just background for everybody, I started in 1979 and a little over half my time was actually in Nevada. And then the other half's been in California, from special district to federal service. California may be further along, but anybody I know would be the first one to tell you, oh boy, we went down some really bad cul-de-sacs. Please don't go that direction. And then anything that we've had success with, it's only been because we just get bombarded with this a little bit more frequently. But as you have some really talented people in that state on the research side and in government service, they, I'm sure, have already told you that the things influencing increasing WUI conflagrations, those are going to move over time into the Pacific Northwest, into the Great Lakes, and more down into eastern parts of the country. We have glimpses of that, but that will pick up over time. So some specific things, David, that are happening that I think are good. We're starting to see little bits of, it's almost like little bits of oil on water, right? kind of plopping together here and there, right? So we're starting to get slow pieces of alignment. Some of them are intentional, some of them are accidental. It's going in the right direction, but I can tell you that the lack of alignment in policy, public policy and private sector practice is a huge piece of getting social adoption and buy-in, because nobody wants to spend that kind of time and effort and still, be stuck uninsured. That probably, I may irritate some folks here, but I'm just going to share this. I think there has been, because I came from local government, there's been a moral hazard at local government to engage in this space. We talk about the property owners, talk about the insurers, talk about everybody else, but local government, the political risks to engage this third rail are real. The actual chances of any individual community burning down are fairly small. And so until there are pressures on local government to take proactive action and face that political headwind, and it's significant, I think we're going to be stuck. So there's a couple of things I'm watching. One of them is after the Palisades and Altadena fires, S&P, Standard & Poor's, and I don't know if Moody's has done it yet, but they came out and they made a statement. They said, based on this and looking at the broader picture, we think that the offerings for general obligation municipal bonds will be affected. And that's because we service the debt on those municipal bonds through the property taxes on properties that are becoming increasingly underinsured or uninsurable. And so if your local finance director starts to see indications that the next bond we take out for a capital project is going to have a lower grading, and by the way, if they'll lower the grading on the insurance companies themselves and the federal government, I'm pretty sure they'll do it to local government. So that's one that I think may nudge us towards understanding that's a risk. The insurance pricing issue, more than anything else, is a signal of uncertainty, but that cost is propagating through other markets, realty, building, mortgage lending, and I just mentioned general obligation municipal bonds. A big part of that driver is the reinsurance component of this, over which we don't have any control. And it is global, and it's tied up with other natural catastrophes. And so as that cost goes up, it's going to put pressure on all of the rest of the insurance systems. You're starting to see some tick up in delinquencies and mortgages in some places. In some parts of the country, escrow rates have gone up like 62% the last few years. So, David, I'm seeing some spontaneous coalescence here and there. Some of it's intentional, some of it's accidental. But I believe it's going to be the financial consequences of no action that are going to affect everybody that will start to move us more aggressively into taking action than we are now.
Thank you, Frank. Chandra, let me give you our last minute for a question.
Okay, so not a question really. I just wanted to thank Frank for his frankness in the conversation, because as a local emergency manager, 2 years ago, our county suffered significant fires. We lost nearly 400 primary homes, and it was a real wake-up call for my county leadership. But even so, there's a reluctance to move that conversation forward. Part of our challenge is we have a high level of development occurring in our county. It is occurring precisely in our WUI, and we have no appropriate ordinances to restrict the building materials, to require fire retardant materials. And it's so frustrating to try and have these conversations. And I think you're absolutely right that it is going to take that huge catastrophic loss where we're looking at just massive financial losses before we can get people to act. I have citizens calling our office all the time, asking whose responsibility it is. Why isn't the county doing this, that, or the other thing? And it comes down to, what part of private property do you not understand? you know, without those ordinances to drive the activity, it's entirely voluntary what the private property owner does or doesn't do on their property.
Great points. I would thank you for your comments. And David, I want to come back to just to finish something. Based on my understanding, I have another colleague, Matt Porteous, is working with the Washington State Fire Chiefs Association, as you know, as we're working on the mitigation alignment. I think you've built a custom approach to how you're dealing with things in Washington. It seems to me like it's pretty robust. There's no elegant, perfect way to come out of those starting gates, right? But to me, it feels like you've got the right stakeholders on board. And obviously, we've already made a commitment to do anything we can to help you there through that project. And so just applaud your efforts. It's impressive to see what you've pulled together. And even though the combustion physics are the same everywhere on the planet, the fuel types, the states themselves, the demographics, cultures, those are all unique. And so you got to find different ways to get to the same outcome. And it seems to me like you're really doing a good job on that.
Thank you. I'm going to stop us there for time and say a big thank you, Steve, Joanne, Matt, Shelby, Michelle, Frank, all of you for speaking and all of the questions and comments today. I will send you the link to survey number 5. You also may have already opened it in the chat link. We will see you next Tuesday, the 29th. You also probably received an invitation for August 5th. And the recording for this and all the meetings is on the webpage. Let us know if you need anything else. Thank you, Dan, for putting all the links in again. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.